topic, Mr. Charles Murito, who is the country manager for Google. Welcome to Power Breakfast.
Thank you, Joey.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Now, we want to talk a little bit about your accomplishments first and a little bit of your background.
Okay.
So, your educational background, you actually studied psychology?
I did psychology and management.
Okay.
And a minor in political science.
Okay.
But I also spent 2 years doing architecture, my first once I got in.
Wow.
Yes.
All right. So a whole bunch of different interests led you to where you are now, but
yes.
you've also worked for Warner Brothers,
yes.
MTV Networks, Africa, yes. and maybe you can just talk a little bit about your journey to this point.
Absolutely. So my journey started right after university, working for Warner Brothers, where I was a management trainee. So it's a great way to actually get into companies whereby you look at a wider array of how the company functions. So I actually started off in human resources, moved into research, and then moved into the internal consulting part of the company, and then ended up on the business development side. And one of the things that I learned most that's critical is how the convergence of technology and the content actually meet, and how critical the two are. So for instance, when you think about DVDs. Most people do not know that DVDs were originally invented by Warner Brothers in association with Toshiba. So content companies consistently are looking at how to disseminate their content in the most efficient manner, and technology plays a really key part in that. So I've always been involved and engaged in technology, not for technology's sake, but really to look at how technology enables many problems to be resolved.
Okay.
So that's always my approach. And then soon after Warner Brothers, moved to London. Again, because in London at the time, around 2005, 2006, they were really at the cutting edge of a lot of innovation. So when you think about IPTV, they had already been doing that. They started launching the red button technology at BBC and green button technology at Sky, and I really wanted to be in the midst of that. So I moved to London, worked for Warner Brothers there for a couple of years, before transitioning over to Turner Broadcasting, which is the parent company for CNN, Cartoon Network, and TCM. And at that point, I was looking after the strategy for Africa, Middle East, and Southern Europe. And so that gave me a really great platform to be more involved and more engaged with what was happening across Africa, and to be really part of the solutions, because I truly believe that when you look at the bigger multinational companies, you can be able to utilize the skill set and the resources that they have to deliver more impact for Africans as a whole. And so that's how I got where I am.
It's been quite a journey. Did you ever envision that you would be working for Google as country manager along that journey?
I never thought about it in terms of companies per se. I always approach my career from an impact standpoint. So what things can I be able to do that can impact the most amount of people at any particular point? So when I was working for Turner Broadcasting, I was looking at how can we be able to invest more in Africa, change the lives and create more jobs through content creation, production, and things along those lines. And so when the opportunity came up with Google, I was really excited to look at that. And for me, the most important thing is how can we utilize Google's resources to make a significant impact across Africa by reducing sort of the challenges of access, but most importantly by democratizing access to information. And when you look at the internet as a whole, it is a net contributor to economic growth. So we are in a really great position to work with government as well as other companies to really make a difference across the continent.
Yeah,
yes.
And we'll talk about accessibility and access across Africa in just a moment.
Yes.
Side note, since you mentioned Turner Broadcasting, do you have any thoughts on the merger with AT&T?
With AT&T, the buyout.
Yeah.
I think it's fantastic. I think when you look at all these companies and AT&T and the world that we're moving to, it's a mobile-first world. So, for instance, when you think of Africa, most people online actually access the internet for the first time, and about 80% of them only on mobile phones. So there has to be a convergence between content and telco companies, and I think other companies are going to continue to follow suit. As you know, Comcast did something similar. Verizon just recently is sort of at the tail end of buying out AOL, and now AT&T is keen to buy Time Warner, which I think is a great thing, because again, without content, technology is not really a solution. You have to be able to have something that you pass through that those pipes.
It'll be interesting to watch how that unfolds.
Exactly.
A lot of talk about that currently. So internet use in Africa right now, people are more comfortable with tech. You've talked about the percentage of people who have access to mobile phones and the internet in that regard. So what is the space right now, and where does Kenya stand in comparison with the rest of African countries in regards to internet usage and accessibility?
Yes. Kenya is actually at the forefront of internet usage and accessibility. For instance, I was just in South Africa this past weekend, and it's really hard to even access Wi-Fi, and you have to constantly keep paying for Wi-Fi on an MB basis across the city in Joburg, and that is a challenge that has been there. However, this is something that we're going to overcome very soon. So, for instance, when you look at the last couple of months since June, July, in Nigeria, data prices have dropped by almost 70%. And that started all the way from MTN to Glo, Airtel and Etisalat. Across the board, they have all dropped the cost of data. However, we cannot kid ourselves. It's still extremely expensive. So across the world as a whole, the cost of data, for instance, is less than 1% of people's income. But in Africa, it ranges somewhere between 8 and 12% of someone's income. And that's really expensive. So we constantly have to look at how do we help drive lower cost of data so that more people can access it, get more utility. And we're doing a couple of things as Google, which I can touch on. One of them is actually doing on the infrastructure side. And for instance, in Kampala and Ghana, we've laid fiber, and we'll continue to look at more of those. And working very closely with telcos. Part of my role at Google is to work very closely with telcos across Africa to see how can we be able to drive better efficiencies of their networks. And we have teams either in Mountain View, in Boston, who work very closely with telcos to look at the efficiencies of content flowing through their pipes and how they can be able to lower the cost and the blockages that can happen through their infrastructure. So there's quite a lot that's happening around that space.
Yeah. When it comes to content creation, you know, who is a digital content creator in this day and age? Because we can't just limit that to, you know, certain organizations. Everyone, it feels like, has something to offer and is putting something online, has a blog, has a YouTube channel. So maybe you can speak on that. Yes,
great question. Everybody is a digital content creator. In fact, we say that every single business is a digital business now, and in the era that we live in. So whether you're selling T-shirts, you know, and you put those online, or you're a mechanic and you put your point of interest and your data online so that people can search and find that. Everyone has to think of themselves as a digital either user, creator, or business, and that's really critical. And the other thing, I think, for some of us who grew up in an earlier age, we didn't have all the technology and the mobile phones, etc., whereby you could go out, create content, put it up, etc. But when you look at even very young people now, they're creating great content and creating businesses around it. There's a lady in the US whose name is Rochelle Pansino. She owns a YouTube channel called Nerdy Namis, and she has about 6 million wow. subscribers. Every time she puts up a YouTube video, literally within the first week, it's over 1 million. And most of her videos average around 4 to 6 million views each, right? And that is a real business. And there's so many of these people across many parts of the world. And here in Kenya, we are working closely to see how we can be able to help drive more of those, because you can create a living by creating content, putting it up online, and then people are always looking for ways to drive their brands through the eyeballs that your content creates, and you can monetize that. So it's something that we really keen to help drive and create more digital jobs across Kenya.
So how important is it to create content that, you know, because what an average Kenyan is watching on YouTube is not, you know, I didn't even know about that YouTube channel that you just mentioned. Maybe I'm just ignorant. But in terms of creating content that is unique to Kenya, to Kenyans, that connects and is able to engage the average Kenyan, how is it that you would advise someone to go about that?
We need to look at it twofold. The first one is about interesting content, and this goes back to sort of my Warner Brothers days. When you think about Warner Brothers, they create content that works across the globe. So think about Friends, 2.5 Men. When you think about the films, Harry Potter, Superman, etc., Batman, those are not US shows or films. They're shows and films that actually work here in Kenya. And so we as Kenyans have to start thinking big, and we have to start thinking about how do you create content that can resonate from a human level across the world. Because if you want to create a great living or earn a great living, you cannot confine yourself only to the Kenyan population or to the African population. You have to be global. So for instance, with Nerdy Namis, it's a baking show. Right?
Oh, okay.
So it's about cakes, and she bakes and just does it really interestingly. So that's content that resonates in Kenya just as much as it would in the US. So we need to start looking at things like that and content creators here. And you know, we have certain people here locally who are already starting to do that and driving quite a number of views. So it's not really about thinking very local. You have to think wider and greater, because the world is now a very small place. So you can be able to connect with a lot more people when you think a lot more broader.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just finally, we're going to continue this session with a couple of ICT entrepreneurs, and they'll come in and ask you some questions. But you have what is probably a dream job for many people, working at Google, being country director. I mean, what sort of do you hope your legacy to be, or what do you hope to accomplish in that role?
A couple of things. One is impact, and when I talk about impact, I mean how can in 5 years' time people look back and say Google was at the nexus of really delivering more digital jobs and digital opportunities in Kenya and to the wider African population. And I'll give you a very tangible example. Tourism. I look at tourism as an economic growth driver for the country as a whole. We currently have about 1 million tourists who come to Kenya every single year, and we can have a potential of a lot more. My ambition is to, by 2020, have that number at 5 million. What does that really mean in real terms? That means creating over 400,000 jobs, right, across tourism directly, because for every 10 tourists that come to Kenya, a permanent job is created. How does Google fit into that mix? Through search, we can be able to articulate how many people are searching about Kenya, specifically around tourism, from all around the world, excluding China, where we're not present. And at the moment, we show that over 3.6 million queries on Kenyan tourism are searched every single month. So if we can only be able to convert less than 1% of that, right, that's about 36,000 tourists coming into Kenya every single month. And we can be able to scale from that. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to use technology to impact the decisions that we make so that we can be able to grow our economy. And if I can be able to do that in the next sort of 3 to 5 years, I think that would be a great legacy to have. And then secondly is around really creating opportunities for the youth. Because when you think about it, we talk about the youth dividend across Africa, but I look at it as a double-edged sword. If we're not able to create opportunities for this youth, then they become a liability to the countries that we live in, because we need to have people who are constructive and have things to do that they can be able to earn a living. And so digital jobs are something that are great. A lot of people can actually work online and resolve certain problems across the world, in really creating Kenya as a best practice center to create those youth jobs. So those, I would say, those will be the two things which I would love. And part of the last part is just have fun doing it.
Right?
Yeah,
it's important.
Yes, exactly.
All right. So like I said, we'll continue this conversation on the tech space in Kenya.